Recording by William Tomko. American Men of Mind by Burton Egbert Stevenson. Chapter 3, Writers of Verse, Part 1. Poetry, says the Century Dictionary, is that one of the fine arts which addresses itself to the feelings and imagination by the instrumentality of musical and moving words. And that is probably as concise a definition of poetry as can be evolved. For poetry is difficult to define. Verse we can describe, because it is mechanical, but poetry is verse with a soul added. It is for this very reason that there is so wide a variance in the critical estimates of the work of individual poets. The feelings and imagination of no two persons are exactly the same, and what will appeal to one will fail to appeal to the other, so that it follows that what is poetry for one is merely verse for the other. Tastes vary in poetry, just as they do in food. Indeed, poetry is a good deal like food. We all of us like bread and butter, and we eat it every day and get good, solid nourishment from it. But only the educated palate can appreciate the refinements of caviar, or gorgonzola cheese, or some rare and special vintage. So most of us derive a mild enjoyment from the works of such poets as Longfellow and Tennyson and Whittier. But it requires a trained taste to appreciate the subtle delights of Browning or Edgar Allan Poe. Now the taste for the simple and obvious is a natural taste, the child's taste, healthy, and, some will add, unspoiled. But poetry must be judged by the nicer and more exacting standard, just as all other of the fine arts must. I wonder if you have ever read what is probably the most perfect lyric ever written by an American. I am going to set it down here as an example of what poetry can be, and I want you to compare your favorite poems, whatever they may be, with it. It is by Edgar Allan Poe and is called To Helen. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, way-worn wanderer bore to its own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land. In 1821, the same year which saw the publication of The Spy, the first significant American novel, there appeared at Boston a little pamphlet of 44 pages, bound modestly in brown paper boards and containing 8 poems. 2 of them were To a Waterfowl and Thanatopsis, and that little volume marked the advent of the first American poet, William Cullen Bryant. Out of the great mass of verse produced on our continent for 2 centuries after the Pilgrim Fathers landed on Plymouth Rock, his was the first which displayed those qualities which make for immortality. Before him, our greatest poets had been Philip Freneau, the poet of the Revolution, Francis Scott Key, whose supreme achievement was The Star-Spangled Banner, Fitz Greene Halleck, known to every schoolboy by his Marco Bozzaris, but chiefly remarkable for a beautiful little lyric on the death of Joseph Rodman Drake, and Drake himself, perhaps the greatest of the 4, but dying at the age of 25, with nothing better to his credit than the well-known The American Flag, and the fanciful and ambitious The Culprit Fay. But these men were, at best, only graceful versifiers, and Bryant loomed so far above them and the other verse makers of his time that he was hailed as a miracle of genius, a sort of Parnassian giant whose like had never before existed. We estimate him more correctly today as a poet of the second rank, whose powers were limited but genuine. Indeed, even in his own day, Bryant's reputation waned somewhat, for he never fulfilled the promise of that first volume, and To a Waterfowl and Thanatopsis remain the best poems he ever wrote. William Cullen Bryant was born at Cummington, Massachusetts in 1794. The son of a physician, from which he received practically all his early training, and who was himself a writer of verse. The boy's talent for versification was encouraged, and some of his productions were recited at school and published in the Poets' Corner of the local newspaper. In 1808, when Bryant was 14 years old, the first volume of his poems was printed at Boston, with an advertisement certifying the extreme youth of the author. It contained nothing of any importance, and why anyone should care to read dull verse because it was written by a child is incomprehensible. But the book had some success, and Bryant's father was a very proud man. 3 years later, Bryant entered Williams College, but soon left, and not having the means to pay his way through Yale, gave up the thought of college altogether, and began the study of law. He also read widely in English literature, and while in his 17th year, produced what may fairly be called the first real poem written in America, Thanatopsis, a wonderful achievement for a youth of that age. 6 months later came the beautiful lines, To a Waterfowl, and Bryant's career as a poet was fairly begun. In 1821 came the thin volume in which these and other poems were collected, and its success finally decided its author to relinquish a career at the bar and to return to literature. In the years that followed, Bryant produced a few other noteworthy poems, yet it is significant of the thinness of his inspiration that, though he began writing in early youth and lived to the age of 84, his total product was scant in the extreme when compared with that of any of the acknowledged masters. His earnings from this source were never great, and, removing to New York, he secured, in 1828, the editorship of the Evening Post, with which he remained associated until his death. In his later years, he became an imposing national figure, but his poetry never regained the wide acceptation which it once enjoyed, largely because taste in verse has changed, and we have come to lay more stress upon beauty than upon ethical teaching. America has never lacked for versifiers, and Bryant's success encouraged a greater throng than ever to lisp in numbers. But few of them grew beyond the lisping stage, and it was not until the middle of the century that any emerged from this throng to take their stand definitely beside the author of Thanatopsis. Then, almost simultaneously, 6 others disengaged themselves: Longfellow, Whittier, Poe, Lowell, Holmes, and Emerson, and remain to this day the truest poets in our history. Of Emerson we have already spoken. His poetry has been, and still is, the subject of controversy. To some it is the best in our literature. To others it is not poetry at all, but merely rhythmic prose. It is lacking in passion, in poetic glow, for how can fire come out of an iceberg? But about some of it there is the clean-cut beauty of the cameo. You know, of course, his immortal quatrain, Rhodora, if the sages ask thee why this charm is wasted on the earth and sky, tell them, dear, that if eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being. More than once he hit the bullseye, so to speak, in just that splendid way. Of the others, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is easily first in popular reputation, if not in actual achievement. Born at Portland, Maine in 1807, of a good family, he developed into an attractive and promising boy, was a classmate at Bowdoin College of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and after 3 years' study abroad, was given the chair of modern languages there. For 5 years he held this position, filling it so well that in 1834 he was called to Harvard. He entered upon his duties there after another year abroad, and continued with them for 18 years. The remainder of his life was spent quietly amid a congenial circle of friends at Cambridge. He was essentially home-loving, and took no strenuous interest in public affairs. For this reason, perhaps, he won a warmer place in public affection than has been accorded to any other American man of letters. For the American people is a home-loving people, and especially admires that quality in its great men. From his earliest youth, Longfellow had written verses of somewhat unusual merit for a boy, though remarkable rather for smoothness of rhythm than for depth of originality of thought. His modern language studies involved much translation, but his first book, Hyperion, was not published until 1839. It attained a considerable vogue, but as nothing to the wide popularity of Voices of the Night, which appeared the same year. 2 years later appeared Ballads and Other Poems, and the two collections established their author in the popular heart beyond possibility of assault. They contained A Psalm of Life, The Reaper and the Flowers, The Village Blacksmith, and Excelsior, which, however we may dispute their claims as poetry, have taken their place among the treasured household verse of the nation. 4 years later, in Belfry of Bruges and Other Poems, he added two more to this collection, The Day is Done and The Bridge. The publication in 1847 of Evangeline raised him to the zenith of his reputation. His subsequent work confirmed him in popular estimation as the greatest of American poets, Hiawatha, The Courtship of Miles Standish, and such shorter poems as Resignation, The Children's Hour, Paul Revere's Ride, and The Old Clock on the Stairs. But after all, Longfellow was not a really great poet. He lacked the strength of imagination, the sureness of insight, and the delicacy of fancy necessary to great poetry. He was rather a sentimentalist to whom study and practice had given an exceptional command of rhythm. The prevailing note of his best-known lyrics is one of sentimental sorrow, the note which is of the very widest appeal. His public is largely the same public which weeps over the death of Little Nell and loves to look at Landseer's The Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner. Longfellow and Dickens and Landseer were all great artists and did admirable work, but scarcely the very highest work. But Longfellow's ballads found an echo in the universal human heart and won him an affection such as has been accorded no other modern poet. His place is by the hearthside rather than on the mountaintop, by far the more comfortable and cheerful position of the two. The year of Longfellow's birth witnessed that of another American poet, more virile but of a narrower appeal, John Greenleaf Whittier. Whittier's birthplace was the old house at East Haverhill, Massachusetts, where many generations of his Quaker ancestors had dwelt. The family was poor, and the boy's life was a hard and cramped one, with few opportunities for schooling or culture. Yet its very rigor made for character, and developed that courage and simplicity which were Whittier's noblest attributes. What there was in the boy that moved him to write verse, it would be difficult to say. Some bent, some crotchet, which defies explanation. Certain it is that he did write. His sister sent some of his verses to a neighboring paper, and the result was a visit from its editor, William Lloyd Garrison, who encouraged the boy to get some further schooling, and afterwards helped him to secure a newspaper position in Boston. But his health failed him, and he returned to Haverhill, removing in 1836 to Amesbury, where the remainder of his life was spent. He had already become interested in politics, had joined the abolitionists, and was soon the most influential of the Protestants against slavery. Into this battle he threw himself heart and soul. It is amusing to reflect that, though a Quaker and advocate of non-resistance, he probably did more to render the Civil War inevitable than any other one man. During the war, his lyrics aided the Northern cause, and as soon as it was over, he labored unceasingly to allay the evil passions which the contest had aroused. He lived to the ripe age of 85, simply and bravely, and his career was from first to last consistent and inspiring, one of the sweetest and gentlest in history. Although Whittier was endowed with a brighter spark of the divine fire than Longfellow, he himself was conscious that he did not possess the seer-like power to show the secrets of the heart and mind. He was lacking, too, in intellectual equipment, in culture, in mastery of rhythm and diction, in felicitous phrasing, and yet, on at least two occasions, he rang sublimely true, in his denunciation of Webster, Ichabod, and in his idyll of New England rural life, Snowbound. The third of these New England poets, and also the least important, is Oliver Wendell Holmes, Born at Cambridge, in the inner circle of New England aristocracy, educated at Harvard, and studying medicine in Boston and Paris, he practiced his profession for 12 years until, in 1847, he was called to the chair of anatomy and physiology at Harvard, continuing in that position until 1882. He lived until 1894, the last survivor of the 7 poets whom we have mentioned. During his student days, Holmes had gained considerable reputation as a writer of humorous and sentimental society verse, and during his whole life he wrote practically no other kind. Long practice gave him an easy command of rhythm, and a careful training added delicacy to his diction. He became remarkably dexterous in rhyme, and grew to be the recognized celebrant of class reunions and public dinners. Urbane, felicitous, and possessing an unflagging humor, he was the prince of afternoon poets, not a lofty position, be it observed, not one making for immortal fame. His high water mark was reached in 3 poems, The Chambered Nautilus, The Deacon's Masterpiece, and that faultless piece of familiar verse, The Last Leaf, all of which are widely and affectionately known. He lacked power and depth of imagination. The field in which he was really at home was a narrow one, and the verdict of time will probably be that he was a pleasant versifier rather than a true poet. His claim to the attention of posterity is likely to rest, not on his verses, but upon a sprightly hodgepodge of imaginary table talk called The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table, a warm-hearted, kindly book which still retains its savor. And this brings us to our most versatile man of letters, James Russell Lowell. Born at Cambridge in the old house called Elmwood, so dear to his readers, spending an ideal boyhood in the midst of a cultured circle, treading the predestined path through Harvard, studying law, and gaining admission to the bar, such was the story of his life for the first 25 years. As a student at Harvard, he had written a great deal of prose and verse of considerable merit, and he continued this work after graduation, gaining a livelihood somewhat precarious, indeed, yet sufficient to render it unnecessary for him to attempt to practice law. But it was not until 1848 that he really struck his gait. Certainly then, he struck it to good purpose by the publication of the Biglow Papers and A Fable for Critics, and stood revealed as one of the wisest, wittiest, most fearless, and most patriotic of moralists and satirists. For the Biglow Papers mark a culmination of American humorous and satiric poetry which has never since been rivaled, and The Fable for Critics displays a satiric power unequaled since the days when Byron laid his lash along the backs of Scotch reviewers. Both were real contributions to American letters, but as pure poetry, both were surpassed later in the same year by his Vision of Sir Launfal. These 3 productions, indeed, promised more for the future than Lowell was able to perform. He had gone up like a balloon, but instead of mounting higher, he drifted along at the same level, and at last came back to earth. The succeeding 7 years saw no production of the first importance from his pen, although a series of lectures on poetry, which he delivered before the Lowell Institute, brought him the offer of the chair at Harvard, which Longfellow had just relinquished. 2 years later, he became editor of the Atlantic Monthly, holding the position until 1861. During this time, he wrote little, but the opening of the Civil War gave a fresh impetus to his muse, his most noteworthy contribution to letters being the Commemoration Ode, with which he marked its close, a poem which has risen steadily in public estimation, and which is, without doubt, the most notable of its kind ever delivered in America. The poems which he published during the next 20 years did little to enhance his reputation, which, as a poet, must rest upon his Biglow Papers, his odes, and his Vision of Sir Launfal. Yet poetry was but one of his modes of expression, and, some think, the less important one. Immediately following the Civil War, he turned his attention to criticism, and when these essays were collected under the titles Among My Books and My Study Windows, they proved their author to be the ablest critic, the most accomplished scholar, the most cultured writer, in a word, the greatest all-around man of letters in America. This prominence brought him the offer of the Spanish mission, which he accepted, going from Madrid to London in 1880 as ambassador to Great Britain and remaining there for 5 years. The service he did there is incalculable. As the spokesman for America and the representative of American culture, he took his place with dignity and honor among England's greatest. His addresses charmed and impressed them, and he may be fairly said to have laid the foundations of that cordial friendship between America and Great Britain which exists today. "I am a bookman," was Lowell's proudest boast, not only a writer of books, but a mighty reader of books. And he is one of the most significant figures in American letters. End of Chapter 3, Part 1. Recording by William Tomko.